It is very rare in Britain for the ruling party to lose a vote in Parliament. It is unprecedented for a government to lose the way Prime Minister Theresa May did yesterday.
The ayes to the right, 202. The noes to the left, 432.
That's right. Theresa May's Brexit plan lost by 230 votes. That's, I don't know, David, like your Pittsburgh Steelers lost the Super Bowl by 10 touchdowns or something.
Wow, thanks, Steve.
Britain now has no deal with the European Union as a deadline nears to leave. Opposition Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn is challenging Theresa May's rule today.
This House can give its verdict on the sheer incompetence of this government and pass that motion of no confidence in the government.
All right, let's bring in Robert Shrimsley of the Financial Times, who has been covering all of this in London. A bit of news there in your country, Robert.
Yeah, morning, David. It was quite remarkable last night. I was actually sitting in the press area of the House of Commons when the vote came in, and we all thought she was going to lose, and we all thought she was going to lose fairly badly, but the scale of it was just breathtaking, and you heard the gasps all the way across the chamber. Nobody thought it was going to be quite as bad as that.
So what do those gasps mean? I mean, there's always a lot of energy and noises coming from British Parliament, but I mean, it sounds like what? I mean, do those gasps mean it's sort of like where does the country go from here after this?
I think the gasps are a direct reflection of the scale of the unhappiness with Theresa May's plan, but it is also, crikey, what happens now. It is, as you said, there's going to be a confidence vote tabled by the opposition today. But the remarkable thing is she's probably going to win this by a relatively small majority. So we will have, you may remember there was a leadership contest to try and topple her by her own party at the end of December. So the overwhelming likelihood is that by the end of the day, we will have a prime minister who cannot get through the most important single piece of legislation she has to manage, cannot be removed by her own party till December, and cannot now be removed by Parliament either. It's a very, very happy place to be.
But in a way, I mean, the fact that she can survive this, what does that tell us about Theresa May and this moment and her leadership?
Well, I mean, as you say, in ordinary circumstances, a defeat like that would be the end. She would have resigned already. Historically, in British politics, if the Prime Minister cannot get her legislation through on anything important, she goes. So it's remarkable that she's going to hang on. I think what it tells us is that nobody has any better plans. The Conservative Party, the government, is terrified of calling an election, which would happen if she falls, probably, because they think they will lose. There is no unity within the Conservative Party as to who an alternative replacement might be, because the Conservative Party is split over the best way forward on Brexit, and that choice would see one side or another losing. Therefore, it suits everybody within the Conservative Party to leave her in place for a bit longer.
Well, you say no one has a real plan. The European Council President Donald Tusk offered a plan in a tweet after this vote. I don't know how serious he was, but he was basically saying, like, look, British Parliament, if you can't figure this Brexit thing out, why don't you just stay in the EU with us? I mean, is that even possible after all this?
Everything's possible. It's not true to say that nobody has a plan. The problem is that everybody has a plan. And
none of them just seem workable.
The fundamental options that lie ahead for Britain are as follows. It can revive Theresa May's plan, or it can find a softer form of Brexit, or it can hold a referendum and try to call it off. All these things are possible. No one would bet a large amount of money in any of them at the moment.
All right. Robert Shrimsley is editorial director and political commentator to Financial Times, covering this extraordinary moment in Britain. A few seem to know exactly where it goes from here. Thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Cheers, David.
All right, it has been nearly a month now since hundreds of thousands of federal workers have gotten paid here in this country.
President Trump invited congressional leaders back to the White House on Tuesday afternoon to discuss an end to the partial government shutdown. House Democrats did not come. The many workers on hold include Frank Rupoli, who's on furlough from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
I feel a little betrayed by our politicians. I got into this many years ago. And I chose to, in a way, serve my country. And I expect the same out of my politicians.
So how are workers getting by?
Well, NPR's Jeff Brady has been trying to answer that question. He's been speaking to a lot of them. Hi there, Jeff.
Hi, good morning.
Just listening to that voice there, I mean, someone who chose to, as he put it, serve his country going through this right now. I mean, how many workers are we talking about who've been impacted by this shutdown? And where do they work?
We started with about 800,000 workers affected, and they're all across the government. None of them have received a paycheck since the shutdown started on December 22nd. Half of those 800,000, about 400,000, they were furloughed initially, so they haven't worked since then. The other half are still working and not receiving a paycheck. The numbers are changing a bit now because some employees are being called back. The IRS is bringing back tens of thousands of workers for the tax filing season. At the Food and Drug Administration, thousands of employees are resuming their work performing food inspections. And the Federal Aviation Administration has recalled several thousand engineers and inspectors. But remember, these employees, they're just being recalled to work. They still aren't receiving a paycheck.
Which is amazing. And we've heard different voices on our air. I mean, one that stays by me is someone who is, dipping into college savings for their kids to try and get by. But you've really been hearing a lot of stories talking to people. So how are federal workers getting by, as you've been hearing?
Yeah, it's really tough because a surprising number of federal employees don't earn a lot to start with. About 1 in 8 workers earn less than $40,000 a year. Some people are taking temporary jobs to bring in money. I talked with a Forest Service employee who lives near Lake Tahoe on the California-Nevada border, and he was picking up odd jobs, fixing a dishwasher or a toilet for somebody, very different from his regular job fighting wildfires. Frank Rapoli, who you just heard from a little bit there, is a graphic designer at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He made a plan after the 2013 partial government shutdown. That one lasted 16 days.
The shutdown a couple of years ago, brought a lot of anxiety on me and my family and, trying to make ends meet. So what I decided to do is go and get my EMT certificate.
So he studied to be an emergency medical technician. And with that, he was able to go out and find a part-time job right away with a company that needs EMTs to fill some shifts. Some federal workers are applying for unemployment benefits. A few of them told me that was a new experience. And others said it was just really tough to find anything, knowing that you might have to go back to work any time.
And on the political front, any movement? I mean, any light at the end of the tunnel for these employees?
Well, Congress passed some legislation that will give workers back pay, so they know in the end they'll get paid, but that doesn't pay the bills now. And there are many contract workers who are just out of luck, but not a lot of movement right now.
Robert Costa, excellent reporter for the Washington Post, well-connected, is reporting that a lot of Republicans he's hearing from, and possibly some Democrats too, I suppose, are at the point where they're expecting some outside force, some outside disaster to be needed to get this shutdown to move in any direction at all.
We'll see if that happens. NPR's Jeff Brady. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
All right, so at least 14 people are dead after gunmen attacked an upscale hotel complex in Kenya's capital, Nairobi.
One question is whether an American is among the dead. We're checking on that. The Somalia-based militant group Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility. Bursts of gunfire and explosions could be heard around the hotel complex more than 16 hours after the attack began. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta has since announced the siege is over and that all attackers are, quote, eliminated.
All right, NPR's Ader Peralta has been on the scene and joins us now. And Ader, have things finally calmed down? Are people feeling a sense of safety? There was shooting going on hours after this took place.
Yeah, there was shooting going on this morning. But right now there are no more gunfire explosions, but there's still a big security presence. And there's still a lot of unanswered questions. What's the total number of people dead? How the terrorists managed to get into a secure hotel. That hotel had 2 checkpoints. It had lots of security. It had metal detectors. So there's a lot of questions left unanswered.
Oh, so this is a hotel that was sort of braced for something like this, and yet this group was able to carry this out, which has to be making a lot of people question security structures in the country after seeing this.
Yeah, I think that's the big question. I think, this is a city that always has braced for these kinds of attacks. That kind of security is not uncommon here in Nairobi. So it leaves people fearing.
And Al-Shabaab, has struck high-traffic civilian areas in Kenya many times in the past. So, what are people saying and telling you about the way forward here if this group is still able to carry stuff like this out?
I think there's a sense of disbelief here. I'm actually at the morgue right now, and it's just a lot of families looking for answers. They're sitting around, they're looking inconsolable. I saw one lady faint. She was overcome by grief. I also spoke to Jasin Jame, who's an older man who lost 2 family members in the attack. He's Somali and a Muslim, communities that always come under suspicion during these times. And what he was saying is that terrorism doesn't make sense. But every time this happens, Kenya has to come to terms with its vast diversity.
And is the government able to deal with al-Shabaab at all? I mean, does anyone feel like the government's going to be able to take care of this militant group?
Kenya is in a tough neighborhood. Al-Shabaab obviously controls huge parts of Somalia, and they will always be a threat, or they're always a threat to Kenya. But the president says that, Kenya embraces peaceful coexistence, but they will never forget those who hurt their children.
All right, NPR's Eder Peralta on the scene of a terrorist attack in Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Eder, thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
President Trump famously said he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose any voters.
Well, now a survey shows a portion of his base support is a bit less solid. This is from the latest NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll. To be clear, this is one survey. We don't know if this is temporary, but this slip comes during a government shutdown and also after the resignation of key officials.
NPR lead political editor Domenico Montanaro is here. Domenico, good morning.
Hey there, Steve.
Hey, what are the numbers?
Well, the president's approval rating is back down to 39%, down from 42% last month. And it is the result underneath that of some slippage with some key parts of his base. For example, in December, suburban men and white women without a college degree had approved of the job the president was doing. Now they don't. And he's also down with white evangelicals and slightly even with Republicans overall. As we noted, it might be temporary, but the poll does show that the president is not faring well during the shutdown.
Well, the president has seemed to assume that funding a wall, which is his demand for reopening the government, is the most important issue for his base supporters. Could he be wrong?
Well, I think one of the potential problems with that is that they also want to see the government function. And Trump's base mostly blames Democrats for the shutdown, but 61% of people overall say that that during this shutdown, they have a more negative opinion of President Trump. That includes almost a quarter of Republicans, 40% of white evangelical Christians, and 55% of whites without a college degree. Overall, the president is shouldering most of the blame for the shutdown. I mean, that's up from when the shutdown first started. And 70% of people, 70%, think that shutting down the government to reach a policy solution is just bad strategy.
Wow, 70%. So let me ask about this, Domenico. If you follow the president's approval rating over the past couple of years, his approval goes up a little, it goes down a little. Sometimes it's in the high 30s, sometimes it gets up to the low 40s. It stayed right in that range. You're telling us it's gotten back down into the into the high 30s again, which is the lower end of that range. But is there any sign he could be headed out of that range as the 2020 presidential campaign begins?
So we started to ask a couple 2020 questions just to sort of get a feeling, a thermometer, a little bit of a temperature of reading of what might be happening in next year's elections. And what really jumped out here is that just 30% said that they would definitely vote for President Trump for re-election. But the percentage of people saying that they definitely would not vote for him was 57%. A president up for re-election normally wants to be close to 40 when it comes to definitely vote for, and definitely under 50.
Yes, 57% say, no way will I vote for this man for president in 2020?
Right. And sometimes these numbers definitely close. President Obama was in a range that was not great for him. 48% in 2010, 2011 said that they would not vote for him. But that's about the percentage that wound up not voting for him. About 47% didn't vote for him in 2012, not 57%.
Okay, so that does not look good, at least at this moment, at least in this one survey for the president. Of course, he's not the only person up for re-election in 2020.
No, he's not. Republicans in the Senate are the ones who are, taking a lot of the pressure here during this shutdown. There have been a few cracks among Republicans who have come out and said that they want this shutdown to end. But Mitch McConnell, also up for re-election, he's somebody who has really been careful not to weigh in too much. But we're going to see if that's going to continue because a lot of people see him as one way out.
Okay, Domenico, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
That's NPR political editor Domenico Montanaro. All right, 2 police officers and a detective are accused of a cover-up in Chicago.
This involves the 2014 fatal shooting of Laquan McDonald. McDonald was 17 years old when he was shot and killed by police officer Jason Van Dyke. Protests swept Chicago after that shooting. Protesters chanted, as we hear, 16 shots and a cover-up after police released dashcam footage of the teenager walking away from the police when the first bullet struck. Activists say the trial of the shooter's colleagues are spotlighting a code of silence in the Chicago Police Department, and a judge is set to announce a verdict today.
NPR's Cheryl Corley is covering this case. Good morning, Cheryl.
Good morning.
How did the officers allegedly cover up?
Well, the prosecutors say that all 3 of these people falsified police reports, and they did so to protect Jason Van Dyke. They said in those reports specifically that Laquan McDonald threatened police officers with a knife before he was shot. Video from a police dash cam video contradicted that, actually showed McDonald walking away from police. So these officers are accused of 3 things: obstruction of justice, official misconduct, and conspiracy.
And I suppose part of the evidence here is that Jason Van Dyke, the officer you mentioned, the man who pulled the trigger, has already been convicted. There's no question about that part of the case, that there was a crime, and you're saying that it was allegedly not in the police reports that they filed.
Absolutely. And he gets sentenced tomorrow for that, but absolutely. He was convicted. People saw that video, and that video was also a big part of this case as well.
Now, how, if at all, does this reflect the broader police culture in Chicago or elsewhere?
Well, I would say first, Steve, I want to talk about Officer Dora Fontaine. She was a key witness in this case who says she found out that her statement about the case included false comments that weren't made by her. And she says she's had to pay a price for coming forward, that she was taken off the streets, that she was assigned to desk duty. And on the witness stand, she explained why.
Other officers were calling me a rat, a snitch, a traitor. If I was at a call and I needed assistance, some officers felt strong enough to say that I didn't deserve to be helped.
So if you talk about this so-called code of silence by police, that's been a real big concern for years in Chicago. The U.S. Justice Department investigated the city, spurred by the Van Dyke shooting, and they issued this really scathing report a couple of years ago, said there's been a pervasive code of silence affecting police misconduct cases here.
And what we're hearing from that witness is effectively that claim. She's saying that other officers pressured me if I tried to say anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely what she's saying. You know, it's not just Chicago, though. It's a problem for other police departments, too. But this conspiracy trial and the Van Dyke trial have just really put a spotlight on what's been happening here. And there's been really some sustained public outrage about what happens to folks who do come forward.
Cheryl, thanks.
You're welcome.
That's NPR's Cheryl Corley. All right, we now know that 4 Americans are dead in Syria, including 2 service members, after an attack that was claimed by ISIS.
Yeah, 2 service members as well as an interpreter and a civilian Pentagon employee among those killed. This is just days after the U.S. said it was beginning the troop withdrawal that President Trump ordered from Syria last month. At the time, he said ISIS was defeated. Well, ISIS says this attack in the city of Manbij was carried out by one of the group's suicide bombers.
NPR's Jane Arraf joins us now from neighboring Iraq, where remnants of ISIS also pose a threat. Jane, what are people saying about this attack?
Well, they're essentially saying that this really complicates President Trump's decision to pull those U.S. troops out of Syria. Because we'll recall that decision was based on the assumption that ISIS was defeated. And if this was ISIS, the attack, this is probably not what defeated looks like. Because it isn't really just about the soldiers and civilians killed, it's about the instability. So at one point, ISIS controlled about a third of Iraq, and with U.S. help, they still have thousands of troops fighting remnants of them. So one government spokesman here says this emphasizes it's still a threat. And then we have to mention Turkey, which also gets a vote in this. The Turkish government issued a statement after the attack saying that they wanted to press ahead with an agreement with the U.S. for military action in Manbij, that agreement from last year. The Turks, though, are in a campaign against a Syrian-Turkish group that they consider terrorists. So they're actually seen as potentially part of the problem rather than the solution here.
Let me just ask, the reason that we think that ISIS is responsible for this attack is only because ISIS said so. Is it clear that ISIS did commit this attack that it claims?
It's not clear, no, but we have to point out, too, this is a hallmark, a particularly effective one of ISIS, the suicide vests. You know, at one point in Iraq, security forces were facing dozens of suicide bombings with suicide vests every day. So I spoke to a senior U.S. military official who doesn't want to speak publicly, who says it's too early to say because they're still investigating, but also because there are claims of responsibility emerging from other groups. And that's particularly tricky because there are always other theories floating around, not based on evidence.
Now we have to mention
there's no word yet on what the White House thinks.
Well, now we have to mention that at about the same time, on the same day as we learned of this attack, we heard from Vice President Mike Pence, who gave the standard administration statement about this. Let's listen to a bit of that.
The caliphate has crumbled and ISIS has been defeated.
Okay, obviously not defeated or not fully defeated, but the ISIS has been substantially reduced. Is it fair to say that much, Jane?
So absolutely fair to say it's been substantially reduced. Now, Pence went on in a tweet later to say they have crushed the ISIS caliphate and devastated its capabilities. So yes, they have crushed the physical caliphate. But the point is, and that's the point shared by his own military people, they haven't eliminated ISIS as a threat. And that's really what we're talking about here. The potential to regenerate and launch attacks like this, which are incredibly destabilizing and feed on the tension between various groups in a very complicated region.
That's NPR's Jane Arraf. Jane, thanks much.
Thank you.
You might sum up President Trump's message yesterday like this: you mess with my State of the Union address, I'll mess with your trip to Afghanistan.
The White House left little doubt that one act was in reprisal for the other. Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, had suggested that President Trump delay a big speech. She said the State of the Union called for intense security work from people who were furloughed or unpaid during a government shutdown. The president then personally denied Pelosi's military transport to Brussels and Afghanistan. He sent a public letter about what had been, for security reasons, a secret visit to U.S. troops. Shortly afterward, news reports said the First Lady took a government flight to the president's resort in Florida. Other government flights are continuing. All this was soon overtaken by other news. BuzzFeed offers a new detail about Michael Cohen, the president's one-time lawyer. Cohen has admitted lying to Congress about the president's business dealings with Russia, and the BuzzFeed report says the president told him to lie.
And let's start there with congressional reporter Kelsey Snow, who is in our studios in Washington this morning. Hi there, Kelsey.
Hey there.
Okay, so this is one news report so far, but if true, and this is pretty serious.
Yeah, BuzzFeed is citing two federal law enforcement officials who are saying President Trump personally directed his attorney Michael Cohen to lie to Congress about the effort to build a Trump Tower location in Moscow. Now, like you said, NPR has not corroborated this reporting, and BuzzFeed credits the information to two unnamed sources who are said to be involved in the investigation. Some congressional Democrats, though, immediately responded to the report by calling for further investigation. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut said it's about time that Special Counsel Robert Mueller let Congress know know what's in his investigation. And House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff tweeted that Trump may have, quote, suborned perjury before the committee and vowed to do what's necessary to get to the truth. Now, Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, has dismissed the reporting, and he's told some reporters, if you believe Cohen, that he can get you a great deal on the Brooklyn Bridge.
Which has been the message from Trump's team about Michael Cohen, this man who President Trump, who was so close to him in the past, they're now trying to undermine his credibility at each step here. Right. Meanwhile, this showdown between the president and House Speaker, I mean, what a back and forth spat developing between these two.
Oh, yeah. And it was kind of a spectacle at the Capitol, too, because Pelosi was on her way to this flight when the president released this letter saying that he was canceling her trip. So the buses had left the Capitol and had to turn back around and deliver Pelosi back to.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's a surprising turn of events, right? Because this isn't something that we usually see a president do. He has the right to do it because he controls military airspace and has, controls her access to a military plane, which we should say is a fairly common way for the Speaker of the House to get around because she really does travel with an enormous security detail. And this was a trip to a war zone. Afghanistan is not the kind of place that the Speaker of the House is likely to be taking a commercial trip, though the president did give that as an option.
Okay, this moment to have a Speaker of the House, a president in a back and forth like this, both suggesting that a government shutdown is to blame, but it seems like there's been no movement to end that shutdown. What does all this tell us about the state of U.S. politics today?
Well, if you were expecting this to be a quick way to end a shutdown, I would say this probably is not it.
Probably not the best way to get along and come to a compromise.
No, and soon afterwards, the House Democrats released another package of spending bills that they want to try to pass to prove that they are making efforts to reopen the government and say it's the president and congressional Republicans who aren't dealing. So we're back at the same place we were just a few days ago.
All right, NPR's Kelsey Snell. Thanks, Kelsey.
Thank you.
All right, so North Korea's top negotiator is in Washington, D.C. today.
His mission is believed to be to arrange a second summit between his boss, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and President Trump. Negotiations with North Korea have been stalled since the last time the two leaders met in a summit in Singapore last June.
And let's turn to NPR's Anthony Kuhn, who is in Beijing. Anthony, good morning.
Good morning, David.
Okay, so neither officials in Washington nor officials in Pyongyang are confirming that new talks are going to take place. But does it appear that that's the reason that this top negotiator is in Washington?
Yes, it does. The negotiator's name is Kim Yong-chol. He's a former intelligence chief and vice chief of the ruling party. And last year, he was in Washington also. In May, he delivered a letter from Kim Jong-un to President Trump, and that paved the way for the first ever summit between the two countries in Singapore. And he's expected to do something like that on this visit. He arrived in D.C. last night, and he's expected to meet with Secretary of State Pompeo and then possibly President Trump before departing on Saturday. One reason this makes sense is because that analysts generally believe that North Koreans want a second summit, and they think it's the only way to have a breakthrough is the presidential level. And so far, they've basically refused working-level meetings, including with Secretary of State Pompeo. Now they seem to want them, probably to work out logistics and an agenda for this meeting.
So am I wrong? It doesn't really seem like there was much of a breakthrough coming out of or since that last big presidential summit last summer. So what is the point of a second summit, and could there actually be risks involved for the United States in meeting again?
Sure. Well, the summit produced a very vague agreement, and denuclearization is part of that, but there was no roadmap on how to get there. So that presumably would be the main aim this time. And the speculation and the reports based on anonymous subjects are saying that this roadmap would have some sort of interim goals, such as, for example, a cap on Pyongyang's nuclear programs. And in exchange for that, they'd get some sort of sanctions relief, which is what they desperately want. One concern that a lot of observers have is that while this cap could lower tensions in the region, it could also be a step towards tacitly admitting or locking in North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, which is exactly what Kim Jong-un wants.
Well, and the Pentagon has a report out. It came out yesterday saying that North Korea's nukes are still an extraordinary threat. So, I mean, using that kind of language to set up a new meeting, I mean, how is that going to go?
Well, it's certainly awkward timing with Kim Yong-chol arriving in town. North Korea has not responded yet. It's also awkward in that President Trump tweeted after the Singapore summit that North Korea's nukes are no longer a threat, and here the Pentagon is putting it in writing. The report also mentions, though, that, there is an avenue to peace with North Korea, possibly, but that could all go south, and so the U.S. needs to remain vigilant, and they seem to have a point there.
All right, we'll see how these talks go with the top negotiator from North Korea in Washington and whether there's going to be another presidential summit. NPR's Anthony Kuhn. We appreciate it, Anthony.
You're welcome, David.
It's going to be a weekend of marches in Washington, D.C. Abortion rights opponents and activists are in town and will be carrying on marches.
Yeah, the March for Life is today. That's been an annual event for many years. And tomorrow, women from around the country and their allies gather for the Women's March for the third year in a row.
NPR's Sarah McCammon covers the abortion debate for NPR. She's going to be attending both marches, but first she is in our studios in Washington. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, David.
So these are not just marches to express points of view. I mean, there's a lot at stake for activists on both sides of this debate this year, right?
Yeah, I mean, just think about how much has shifted since President Trump took office, and especially this past year with a new Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh now on the court. I mean, it was just this past summer that Justice Anthony Kennedy announced his retirement, setting up a huge debate over the future of the court. Of course, he was seen as the swing vote on a lot of issues, including reproductive rights. And March for Life has been happening every year for decades, since the 70s, soon after the Roe versus Wade decision legalized abortion nationwide. But this is the first time, David, in decades that a lot of abortion rights opponents see what they feel is an opportunity to really substantially roll back abortion rights and for the court to have a chance to revisit Roe, something they've been working toward for a very long time.
I mean, even the idea of revisiting Roe, does that have people who are putting together this March for Life feeling emboldened, optimistic?
Yeah, they're definitely optimistic, cautiously optimistic, I would say. Activists tell me they're not necessarily expecting to see Roe reversed wholesale, but they do see a big opportunity here to advance restrictions on abortion that might not have stood up in the past under previous challenges. Here's Tom McCluskey of the March for Life.
If you would have asked me during the 2016 campaign that President Trump would be the one that would help in putting in these pro-life policies, I probably would have thought you were crazy. But it's certainly a much different scenario now with both Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh on the bench.
And we've heard this a lot from abortion rights opponents. They're happy with President Trump's efforts to restrict public funding for organizations such as Planned Parenthood and to appoint conservative judges.
And so as optimistic as people are on putting together the March for Life march, how nervous are abortion rights activists at this moment?
They're nervous. They're concerned. They're also energized. Tomorrow is the Women's March, which comes at these issues and others from another point of view. And Planned Parenthood is a sponsor. So I would expect to hear a lot about women's reproductive rights this year in particular. I spoke recently with Dr. Lena Wynn, the new president of Planned Parenthood.
This is a time where everything is online. I mean, with Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, we are facing a situation where within the next year, Roe versus Wade could very well be further eroded or overturned.
And with that expectation, David, reproductive rights activists are organizing at the state level, trying to strengthen laws protecting abortion rights and remove restrictions on abortion. They do say they're energized and encouraged by the midterms, with a lot of Democrats, especially a lot of women and others campaigning on issues, including reproductive rights, were elected. And of course, Democrats took over the House of Representatives.
You know, one of the things I've learned from your reporting is you have to look beyond the Supreme Court when it comes to this debate.
Absolutely. If Roe versus Wade is weakened or overturned, a lot of the debate will go to the states. The states will have even more power to restrict abortion rights than they do right now. So with all the attention on these big national marches, it's still important to keep an eye on state houses all over the country.
All right, NPR's Sarah McCammon, who will be covering those marches in Washington this weekend. Sarah, thanks.
Thank you.
Fund the Wall and DACA recipients will get 3 more years of protection.
That is the deal that President Trump has offered over the weekend to end the partial government shutdown. Vice President Mike Pence called this offer, quote, a good faith compromise on Fox News Sunday.
The Senate leadership, Senator McConnell, have agreed to bring this bill to the floor on Tuesday.
Even still, it doesn't look like an agreement is on the horizon. As soon as Trump made his announcements, Democrats rejected his offer. And what happens now is the big question as hundreds of thousands of federal employees get ready to miss yet another paycheck.
So we've got NPR White House correspondent Scott Horsley with us this morning. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, Rachel.
First, can you just explain in more detail what the president was offering and why exactly did Democrats find it to be insufficient?
Sure. Under the president's proposal, Trump would get the $5.7 billion he wants to build a 230-mile stretch of border barrier. And in exchange, he's offering a temporary reprieve from deportation, both for the DACA recipients, that's the young people who were brought to the country as children, as well as several 100,000 Haitians and Central Americans whose temporary legal status is in danger of running out. Now, we should say some conservative commentators complain that the president's going too far here. They're calling this an amnesty. But in both cases, the reprieve from deportation would be for just 3 years. And that's why House Democratic Whip James Clyburn says his party is rejecting the president's offer.
I think it's a non-starter for him to ask for a permanent wall and for us to have a temporary fix.
Now, we should add, in both these cases, Trump would be temporarily fixing a problem that he himself created in rescinding DACA and the temporary legal status. This is a sort of standard Trump bargaining tactic. You do something your negotiating partner doesn't like, and then you offer to stop in exchange for concessions on the other side's part.
So Democrats keep saying, we're not even going to talk to the president until he reopens the government. Only then will we even engage on a conversation about potential border wall funding. But that seems to be a non-starter for the White House. I mean, is the administration even considering doing that?
You know, Democrats will sweeten their offer a little bit this week. The House is expected to pass legislation that would reopen the government and include some additional money for border security measures, but not the wall. Democrats want to show that, contrary to what the president's been saying, their opposition to the wall does not mean opposition to border security. And then on the Senate side, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is stirring himself to action, and they're going to vote on the president's proposal. On the surface, Rachel, none of this looks likely to produce a resolution of the shutdown, but the question is going to be, does the president's offer change the blame game? Up until now, Trump and the Republicans have shouldered the lion's share of blame for the shutdown, and only if Trump's offer changes that public perception will Democrats feel any pressure to give ground.
Yeah. And meanwhile, Friday is supposed to be payday for the 800,000 or so federal workers impacted by this shutdown. And, I mean, they're anticipating not getting another check, right?
That's right. And obviously that is a great deal of hardship for those individuals. At the macro level, Rachel, it means that the jobs numbers for January that are going to come out early next month will show those furloughed workers subtracted from the overall employment picture. That could be the first negative job growth we have seen since 2010. And ultimately, it'll be reversed when the workers get back pay. But it's going to be a temporary stain on what has been a record run of job growth in this country.
NPR's Scott Horsley for us this morning. Scott, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Did you see this over the weekend? A viral video of a confrontation at the Lincoln Memorial has a whole lot of people seeing what they want to see.
Yeah, for some, the video shows a group of white high school students wearing Make America Great Again hats, mocking a Native American protester who's playing a drum.
Meanwhile, other people saw the Native American activist intentionally walk into the crowd in an act of provocation. As longer videos emerge showing even more perspectives, we're going to try to understand what actually happened there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and the fallout. And to do that, we are joined by Bill Reinhart of member station WVXU in Cincinnati, who's been covering this story. Bill, thanks for being here.
Good morning.
So these boys are students at Covington Catholic High School in Kentucky, which isn't far from where you are in Cincinnati. They were in D.C. for the March for Life against abortion rights. And one student in particular named Nick Sandman, he was the guy seen in the original video standing face to face with Nathan Phillips, the Native American activist. So, Bill, what can you tell us? What are each of these people, what are they saying about what happened?
Well, Mr. Nathan Phillips, in a video that circulated Saturday afternoon after the initial videos all on social media, he said he didn't going on. They were having their march, and suddenly he felt like he was surrounded by young men and was confused about what the whole interaction was. Now, the young man in question, the one that everyone has seen in the video, he released a statement Sunday evening and says that a lot of what people are saying is untrue. He says they were waiting for buses to pick them up after their attendance at the pro-life ceremonies, and he says suddenly there was a group of protesters on the Lincoln Memorial who started harassing them, and one of his classmates got permission from a chaperone to start a school chant. And he says that's when the Native American protesters approached our group.
We should say that the students also say they're the ones who were vilified by yet another group who was also gathered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. This is a group called the Black Israelites here in D.C. They're known for shouting racist and offensive things, and they were doing that at these particular students. So this is really complicated. But the school has actually come out, the high school where these kids go to school, they have come out and condemned the students? Is that right?
They made a statement on Saturday that says, "We condemn the actions of the Covington Catholic High School students toward Nathan Phillips specifically and Native Americans in general." They extended apologies to Mr. Phillips, and they said the behavior is, quote, opposed to the church's teachings on the dignity and respect of the human person.
Yeah, as you point out, Nick Sandman, the young man in the video, insists that he was actually trying to diffuse the situation, that Nathan Phillips, the Native American activist, actually walked into the crowd and was approaching these students. This is Nick Sandman's version of events, and the young man says that he was not being confrontational at all. So this is clearly confusing. How are people in the community responding?
There are people on both sides, folks who say these kids have acted incorrectly, and there are those who say the whole thing has been misunderstood and people should wait till all the facts come out.
Bill Reinhardt of member station WVXU. Bill, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, the number of deaths continues to rise in a gas pipeline explosion in Mexico.
At least 85 people have been killed and dozens more are injured and missing. This explosion occurred in Hidalgo, which is about 2 hours from Mexico City, and it came hours after this pipe ruptured, sending a geyser of fuel into the air at a spot where people illegally tapped into the pipeline to siphon off fuel. And this is actually not a new problem. Mexico's president has tried to address this fuel theft, but with rising prices and a shortage of fuel, that's proven really challenging.
NPR correspondent Carrie Kahn joins us on the line from Mexico City. Good morning, Carrie.
Good morning, Rachel.
What do we know at this point about the explosion? What actually happened? Who's responsible?
The exact person who tapped into the pipeline outside the small town in Hidalgo, we don't know, but authorities say they're looking into it. The Attorney General says he will not prosecute those who joined in and were helping themselves to the free gas. He says he doesn't want to re-victimize the people. You know, as you said, this spot is a favorite around here for fuel thieves, and that practice is widespread throughout Mexico. Last year, the president says it cost the state oil company Pemex around $3 billion a year. And many in towns like this town, where the gasoline pipelines run through, benefit from the practice, either buying cheaper black market gas or protecting criminal organizations. There's also one big question in the investigation. Is that police and armed soldiers were called immediately to the gas breach when it occurred, and for 2 hours they were on the scene, and they didn't or they couldn't disperse the crowd that at one point reportedly grew to 600 to 800 people.
Wow.
So they just want to get to the bottom of that, why that happened.
I mean, this explosion is obviously horrible. People died, but this bigger problem, significant problem, I don't want to call it bigger, but the fact that people are stealing gas, I mean, clearly they just can't afford to buy gas. That's what is Mexico trying to do about that?
Well, the president has launched a crackdown against what he says is this widespread criminality. He's told the country in the weeks that he's been starting the crackdown, just how deep this corruption has gone to allow this practice to be so widespread. It's gone, he's implicated local officials, gas station owners, Pemex, the oil company's top officials. The head of security for the company is being implicated in the practice, But the other answer is these pipelines run through rural, poor regions of Mexico where poverty's high and opportunity is low. And as you said, gasoline is expensive. It's expensive here. It's about $4 a gallon.
Wow.
And so, I talked to people out in Hidalgo before the blast, and they say, salaries are low here. People do what they do to get by, and black market fuel is cheap, so they buy it.
All right, NPR's Carrie Kahn for us this morning on this pipeline explosion in Mexico. At least 85 people have been killed, dozens more injured and missing. Carrie, thanks very much for sharing your reporting on this. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.